Good afternoon. It's Wednesday, the 8th of June, 2016, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Mike Robinson, and with me in the studio today, Patrick Henningsen. And joining us by Skype is Alex Thomson from Eastern Approaches. Alex, welcome to the programme.
Thank you, Mike. It's a sweltering day here in Holland, so I have the window here open in my study. So if you hear the occasional traffic horn or whatnot, that explains why. Otherwise, I would swelter here. Okay,
no problem. Let's get straight on. And of course, the big news of the day was the alleged debate. And Pat, it's spectacular how both the BBC on their website here and ITV News immediately after the alleged debate present an image which implies that there was actually a debate.
There was so much hype before this, Mike. I was getting excited. It reminded me when I think it was Mike Tyson fought Larry Holmes or something like this, or Evander Holyfield, and everyone bought beer and went and got ready. We did that, and we were really excited, but hugely deflated.
Yes.
Immediately after you started, you could see this wasn't a debate at all. There would be no head-to-head confrontation between Nigel Farage and David Cameron. Totally stage-managed, completely sanitized. I would say, dare say, including planted questions from the audience.
And it looked very like...
and rehearsed answers.
Yes, absolutely rehearsed answers. Both Nigel Farage had his passport ready, although he was, in fairness to him, he was demonstrating a little more capability to ad-lib than David Cameron
He was challenged. Farage was challenged by members of the audience, whereas Cameron, it was underhand softball.
Well, this is pretty much what Cameron had to say. Jobs economy, jobs economy, jobs economy. Didn't matter what the question was, the answer was jobs economy.
Yeah, that's right. Stonewalling, they call it.
Yes, well, Farage was at least challenged, and the people in the audience quite a bit more aggressive with him than the questioners for Cameron.
Yeah, and to his credit, Farage brought up a number of key economic points that I think are very difficult to beat in an argument. One of them is the fact that the UK buys a lot more product from Europe each year than Europe buys from the UK.
Yes.
So in terms of any trade negotiations or scaremongering regarding tariffs on British businesses, I really don't think that's going to happen, because I think Britain would have the upper hand in any trade negotiations with the EU, if I'm not wrong, if they're the bigger buyer, right?
The European Union cannot afford to lose Britain as a trading partner. The implication from the Remain camp is that Britain can't afford to lose the EU. It's actually the other way around, because we have a staggering trade deficit with the European Union.
And in fact, the European Union wants to increase its trade with Britain. It doesn't matter whether it's a member or not, Mike.
Absolutely.
So.
But Farage also mentioning the EU army, of course.
At the very end, slipped that one under the rug. But it was kind of, I think, Mike, this is a prelude of things to come over the next 2 weeks. If that was the opening salvo from the mainstream media with regards to Brexit, this whole thing has been stage managed. It'll be absolutely bespoke, contrived affair right till the last second.
It was a bit pathetic, wasn't it?
It was very disappointing.
Okay, well, Alex, old white men are the problem.
Yes, Mike, just to dovetail onto that about the Farage stuff. Well, I'll talk about this while it's on screen first. It's the EU referendum campaign contribution by Pat Glass, which was on screen just there. She is a Labour MP in the northeast of England. And she said on the record in the meeting, go and campaign. This is the usual patronising talk to young people out there who are supposedly all Europhile. Go out and talk to everyone. Talk to your grandmother, but don't talk to your grandfather, because we know that old white men are the problem. So I gather my father is dipping his toe in the water of the UK column and maybe watching us live for the first time today. So, Dad, if you're watching, you're the problem. Remember that.
Well, there was a bit of that. There was a bit of that last night as well. One particular questioner of Nigel Farage really suggesting that he was quite the racist.
Well, she was one member of the public who was, I don't know what the correct term would be, Afro-Caribbean, but I'm not even going to say that, Mike, because I don't know whether she was of Caribbean descent. However, she was insinuating that because Nigel Farage was anti-immigration, or anti-open borders, basically, he's probably not anti-immigration full stop, but anti-open borders, that was the equivalent of being anti-black.
Yes. Which
is a kind of a big jump to make when you think about it. But this is the sort of jump which is routine these days in this kind of, I don't know what to call it, kind of weaponized, politically correct environment that we have on both sides of the Atlantic.
Yes, I noticed that the three questioners whom Farage had, three of his nastiest ones, were young ladies. Well, hardly merit the term ladies the way they behaved. And the first one was told to calm down because she was saying you're accusing everyone who's coloured of rape. And he said, no, I'm not, calm down. The second one, he replied, no. And the third one said something ridiculous. He said, your facts are simply wrong. Whereupon the Channel 4 guy covering it live promptly tweeted out, oh, I can't believe it. Farage has engaged with 3 young women and he's told them all that they're wrong.
Yes. Right. Well, let's move on. So Northern Ireland, apparently we're going to head back to the Troubles if we should leave the European Union. Alex?
Yes, this is pretty incredible. The French press ought to be concentrating on the social implosion. It's being called a colour revolution and a second French revolution now, this summer of strikes. Even by French terms, it's extreme. And of course, martial law is in force, so you can't hold a protest meeting of more than 3 people without the police giving their say-so. And yet, Le Monde and the business paper Les Echos find time to maunder on daily the Brexit and how much it's going to damage Britain and damage the European Union, even though, as I've covered on shows before, the French are the most realist of the continentals and say, why don't the British up sticks and leave? We know they don't want to be in the EU. But there you are, their media class is still not prepared to say anything like that. And in this particular article, an intrepid Le Monde journalist goes off to the border near Newry, of course, where there was heavy fighting in that area during the Troubles. And the headline says that the spectre of Brexit is reawakening old fears. So as you read on, it's basically raising the spectre of the Troubles and suggesting that there's going to be checkpoints and guerrilla warfare if the UK leaves, which is quite interesting because we have a CTA, a common travel area with the Irish Republic, which predates the EU. In fact, it goes back to the inception of the Free State.
Well, that's absolutely right, Alex. And all through this week, in fact, George Osborne was in Northern Ireland yesterday, and he was, or the day before, and he was absolutely pushing this idea. He was tweeting out images of truckers heading across the Northern Irish border, saying, of course, once we leave the EU, this won't be possible anymore. This is really an aspect of the Remain campaign, particularly from Osborne and Cameron. Quite a lot of what they're saying is simply untrue.
Yes, and as the EU has dominated public consciousness the last 10 or 15 years, people have forgotten what they used to know about the range of treaty agreements that Britain has, which predate and are anterior and superior to the EU, with the Commonwealth, with the Republic of Ireland, with the United States. Our intelligence and military links are with them. If we want to leverage and pool forces militarily, we already have people to do that with. They're called the US, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, not France, Germany, or Italy. People are forgetting that. And by the way, the Irish Republic, of course, is not in Schengen. So quite where there's going to have to be a border, there's no security or customs reason for that, because the Irish Republic will not be in the Schengen zone after we leave, if we do, even more than it was or is at the moment.
Of course, you pointed out to me today that this is the real menace in Ireland, not so much whether we're in the EU or not, and certainly not any return to the Troubles. I wonder, are these ex-paramilitaries themselves?
They could well be, although it's in County Clare in the sort of mid to southwest of Ireland, which wasn't a particularly Provo county in the past. But if you look on YouTube for Corofin, Corofin, in County Clare, you will see that, I think it was on the 20th of May, there was one of these repossessions, and the campaigners around Ben Gilroy are taking this to the Dáil and to the banks now, that people are killing themselves every day with these repossessions and the evictions. Well, anyway, in this occasion, the home was invaded by these men in balaclavas with the guards, the Irish police, backing them up. and they challenge the constable who's got his Limerick badge number showing, and he tries to say, "I'm here to enforce the warrant," and then he realises he's on camera and has goofed, and he said, "No, I'm here to prevent a breach of the peace," because of course Ireland is common law too and has the English version of breach of the peace different from the Scottish. So he's there desperately trying to say something which isn't, "I'm here to help the heavies steal your house from you," and he says, "Well, I'm not here to enforce the warrant, you'll have to talk to these guys." And then whereupon the homeowner and his friends say, "Well, why are they in balaclavas?" "Oh, that's just the clothing for the job, like I'm in a police uniform," he says. And then he sort of gives an imprimato for the balaclava guys to take over. And they start, having entered his property without common law permission to do so, start asking the homeowner, "Who are you? What are you doing here?" Whereupon the homeowner says, "Well, who gave you permission to ask questions? What are you doing here?" And after a few minutes of this, they're chased off to a car. There's various other things that happen in the clip, like the guys who came in a balaclava haven't got a valid number plate, and the Gardaí, instead of following that up, say, "Don't touch the car," when the protesters or the homeowner's nowhere near the car, he's just pointing at it. The whole clip reveals that the guards are just, they're transparently there to help a private company with people who won't even show their faces steal the house without even any semblance of a warrant.
So these guys are clearly unhappy about appearing on camera. But Alex, what's your view on where this is going to end? Because this situation isn't going to reduce over the next few years. The only possible outcome, particularly when interest rates begin to go up, as they must, is we're going to see more repossessions. And really, the people that are fighting this at the coalface at the moment are hopefully setting a precedent for the future. But in the meantime, we have more and more paramilitary style bailiffs turning up to remove property from people. This can't end well.
It certainly won't end well, and I think where it will end is probably on a national level, with the Irish Republic being the first jurisdiction to capitulate, so that the government will actually give people their common law rights back or not interfere with them anymore. Because even during that clip, there's references being made to the Land League and the Black and Tans, the late 19th century, early 20th century history of Ireland, of the farms being turfed out by English agents and so on. So it's incredibly embarrassing and upsetting for anyone involved with this. Any policeman in Ireland knows what this history is. It's drummed into them at school. Maybe less so now because of EU propaganda, but that's their history. And so that they have already done things like blocking auctions being run in Dublin by English auctioneers to sell off these houses. Men have stood up and said, you have no goodwill to sell this property, you're breaking common law, and remember Irish history. I think in the end it will end up at an EU level, because the guy in that clip was actually invited. I think shamefully it was only the Sinn Féin MEP of the Irish Republic who was prepared to invite him over, but he testified to an evidence session of the European Commission. I think he showed them the clip as well, and there's not many news sources on what happened, but they were clearly shocked. And unlike the UK, the Irish Republic takes the European Commission very seriously, and if they get wrapped over the knuckles, they may actually do something about it.
Yes. Right, well, getting back to the EU referendum slightly for a second, here we've got Heidi Alexander, who's the Shadow Health Secretary, and she was giving a speech to Unison this morning, and saying that if we were to leave the European Union, that would be a very real threat to the NHS. She said, "A vote to leave the EU is a very real threat to the NHS. The NHS cash crisis is already the worst in its history." How did that happen? Was that the EU did that, Patrick, do you think?
I don't think so.
No.
I think the NHS did it.
No, I
think
the government did it, yes.
To the NHS.
To the NHS. But if we vote to leave Europe in 2 weeks' time, we risk plunging the health service into even deeper crisis. In the worst case scenario, the Tories would have to cut the Department of Health's budget by £10 billion to meet their promise of balancing the books by the end of the decade. These are cuts that would be bad for staff and bad for patient care. This was, it's quite similar rhetoric to the rhetoric we were hearing from Cameron last night. It's all bad for staff, bad for patient care, soundbitey type rhetoric. There are also huge unknowns, she said, about what would happen to the tens of thousands of staff from the EU who are working in hospitals up and down the country, helping to deliver excellent care to patients. So I'll come to you both. I'll start, Pat. What's my view on the sort of scare tactics that are being used by the Remain campaign? What's your position on it?
Well, with regards to the NHS, there's only two issues there that are quite obvious. One is that staff who are from European countries who are working for the NHS are not going to be turfed out on the street if Britain votes to leave the EU. That's just a ludicrous scaremongering tactic. They're not going to start purging the employment rolls. No company is, and it's not going to happen. The other thing is, if Britain did vote to leave the EU and, let's say, immigration, open borders slow down somewhat, this would mean less wait time for patients in the NHS. Am I wrong on the math on that? Might go in that direction, and that means also less cost, right, for the NHS. So I can't see how she can back up these statements.
No. Alex, what are your thoughts?
I'm afraid first I'll have to say that you're now inaudible to me and apparently to the viewers as well because of the microphone dropping out at your end, Mike.
Well, Alex, there's no problem with the mic. I can see it. I can see the levels on the screen here.
Well, that's unfortunate because I've got a heavy hit and I can see a lot of the viewers have, so I'm not quite sure who's interfering there. But it's not in the studio; it must be elsewhere.
Right. Well, we'll just have to press on, Alex. There's nothing we can do about it.
No problem. Well, all I would say about health service funding is that none of the continental countries seem to have a problem with it. In fact, the degree of coverage they have of their health systems is actually increasing over time as prudent managers take over. And I think that what's being suggested is that of the NHS going bust is either psychological operations, or it may have to do with the fact that in the NHS model, we seem to want to offer the whole world healthcare, not just our own people.
Okay, well let's just remind everybody of this article on the UK Column website. The NHS common purpose towards 1 million change agents. If you want to know why the NHS is in such a mess at the moment, perhaps this gives a clearer picture. Do have a read at it if you haven't read it yet. If you have read it, please get this shared around the place on the various social media and make sure that people have had a chance to read it. Now, the next threat, because we're talking about threats with regard to the EU referendum, the next threat is to our pensions, and this is Eddie Truell, who's the former chairman of the London Pension Fund Authority and founder of the Pension Insurance Corporation, and he's saying that backing Brexit would protect Britain's pensions. He's saying that 130,000 people have public sector pension pots, £18 billion worth of assets, that Brussels are demanding 15 times the entire British defence budget when it takes control of the pension pots, because they are about to put a tax burden on that. Well, I would just remind everybody once again that if there's any burden on British pensions, particularly public sector pensions, we need to understand the UK outstanding debt situation. There is a £5 trillion black hole. Let's just reiterate that. That's a £5 trillion black hole in the public sector pension pot and the state pension pot, as if you take those together, because British pensions are a Ponzi scheme and they require people to be paying in at the bottom. Now, this was one of the comments, Pat, that was made last night, that we need immigration in this country to make sure that there's that flow of money coming into the bottom to pay our pensioners.
And it's kind of amazing if you look at the unemployment rate, Mike, that there's nowhere near full employment in this country. So I don't understand the argument that you just need a constant flow of immigrants in order to fill jobs. And the scaremongering extended to, we have an aging population and we need people who are going to sweep up the floors behind our old age pensioners while they're living in assisted care facilities. Who's going to do that? Well, not the British native. We need people from exotic third world countries to do those sort of jobs in nursing and etc. So the whole conversation is totally convoluted, and it is just, if that was the opening salvo, Mike, completely off the charts in terms of hyperbole. I can't wait to see what it's going to be like in 2 weeks.
Indeed.
It's going to be really entertaining.
But Pat, British bankers providing lots of money to influence EU policy.
Yes, so this is the City of London. What this goes to show, Mike, is that the City of London, whether Britain is in or out, it's neither here nor there for the city. The city will go on and do its business. This shows you how much money they're willing to plow into lobbyists in Brussels to get policy changed the way they want so that they can carry on with their creative financial instruments, and also to hold a gun to the head of the government, which happens quite often, saying, oh, we have to keep the financial sector competitive because we'll lose all the talent. The talent won't come to the city, and if you want to keep us here, you have to keep it as deregulated as possible. Zero interest rates, creative exotic instruments, over-leveraging, margin buying, etc., bonds galore, credit default swaps. This is, to keep us, you need to give us all these things. What does that do? Plunges us into the debt and the black hole, which you just illustrated on that pie chart. And then the government's reaction to that is, we must impose austerity. We must cut the NHS to get it back online. So you can see who's the progenitor of the problem, really, and it's in the City of London.
Absolutely. Alex, any thoughts on that?
That's it. I would say both of you are spot on there. I mean, I've seen through being at public school in Cambridge the kind of international chap or girl these days who rises to that level of Kennedy School of Governments, McKinsey or whatever. It turns them. They turn from being nice people who have goodwill towards the country that's educating them to internationalists within a short space of time. They often end up hating their own countries as well. If they're Slavs, Russians, for example, they end up turning right against Putin and the Kremlin and becoming good little Sorosites, really. So it's a square mile that breeds a contemptuous globalist mindset.
Well, there's at least one country on the planet which is not playing ball with them, because here we have Iceland once again. This article from Bloomberg this morning saying Iceland has gone its own way since its three largest lenders collapsed in 2008 under a mountain of debt, almost 8 times the size of its economy. The steps included capital controls that locked hedge funds, mortgage write-downs, and throwing bankers in jail. So with the recovery well underway, it goes on to say the island nation, once a hedge fund paradise, is continuing on its isolated path. Lawmakers have effectively outlawed the kind of trade that inflated the bubble a decade ago, protecting against a repeat. Surrounded by sub-zero interest rates, Iceland's benchmark gauge of 5.75%, the highest in the developed world, is luring cash from abroad. And they go on to point out that there are cash inflows coming into Iceland, as they've just said there, because of the high interest rate that's available on Icelandic bonds at the moment. So they have taken action to prevent any kind of Soros-like financial shenanigans. And Iceland continues to take a fairly brave stand on this.
Yeah, so they're putting up their defenses for hostile attacks from Wall Street, from the City of London, from the usual suspects, to go in and contaminate the economy and then collapse it and then buy everything on pennies on the dollar and then rebuild it again, and etc. So Iceland is smartened up, and I think, Mike, they're still the only country that's ever actually jailed any of the bankers for the fraud that has been perpetrated over the last 15 or 20 years.
Well, so far, you know that we are running various investigations into some pretty low-level traders with regard to LIBOR, but no serious bankers in this country or in the United States.
Yeah, and I might also point out, this is the number one product in the British economy. It's financial services. It's bigger than pharmaceutical, it's bigger than all these sectors, and it's rarely talked about, if at all, even in this conversation with regards to the EU and Brexit.
It's quite interesting, Alex, that when it comes to Iceland, the Bloomberg article there quite soft in its language when it discusses Iceland. Iceland has gone its own way. It's an isolated path. On the other hand, when China puts in interventions into the markets to prevent Soros-type activity there, attacking China, the rhetoric is quite a lot stronger.
Yes, Mike. It's almost as if Bloomberg thought that they could get away with, war with Iceland because it's supposedly a small and insignificant nation. Well, okay, it might be the proverbial rock in the North Atlantic, although it's a rock bigger than Ireland, actually. It's a huge place geographically. But it would be wrong of the news to think that they can sideline Iceland because the moral example it sets, simply by its new constitution, which is spreading like a meme across the nations of the world. You know, people are reading it and thinking, well, this is the kind of constitution we need. That is going to cause the shockwaves in the end because, you know, they have a population of about 1/3 more people live on certain streets in London or New York than live in the whole of Iceland. But although there's an extreme population difference with China and an economic difference, the Icelanders are going to set, you know, a path. They're ploughing their own furrow, all right, but they're going to have others following in their wake for sure.
Yeah. Okay, Patrick, let's move on to the United States and the reality TV show that's going on over there.
So it was a big day yesterday, and of course the Associated Press and others had called the California primary even before the actual votes came in, and in some cases before anyone voted full stop for Hillary Clinton on the Democratic side. So she had a big day yesterday, taking California in the primaries, and also I believe taking New Jersey, Montana, New Mexico, and
South Dakota.
So with Bernie Sanders clawing back a very small state in North Dakota. And so pretty big day for Hillary. Still, however, Mike, officially she hasn't clinched the nomination. So again, this comes back to the issue of superdelegates. Those are meant to vote on the 23rd or 24th of July. So until those superdelegates actually cast their votes, but what the media is doing and what the Democratic National Convention is trying to do is count those superdelegates before they actually cast their ballot based on polling. So she's now the presumptive nominee based on the superdelegate system, which is probably the most undemocratic component of the American electoral system. So contrast this with Donald Trump. He's officially clinched the Republican nomination. Nothing's going to stop him from being the GOP nominee, save some major scandal or worse. Let's hope that that doesn't happen or no one gets hurt at the convention. But so America will now start gearing itself up for the ultimate gladiatorial battle, which will be crooked Hillary and dangerous Donald.
I mean, surely the Fiscal Times was drunk when they wrote that headline.
Yeah, so Donald Trump has managed to assign a moniker to all his opponents and has been victorious. As soon as he assigned Lying Ted or Little Marco, they went by the wayside immediately. So he's done this with Hillary, crooked Hillary, and to some degree it's stuck. But I think the Clinton camp is hitting back. Dangerous Donald, but that kind of sounds a bit risque, almost a bit sexy, dangerous Donald. So I'm not sure if the opposing side there is going to do much to cut down Trump, who's a media juggernaut. We'll see what happens in the next couple of months.
Yes. Okay. Alex, the book spot today, you wanted to cover the media and Evelyn Waugh's book, Scoop.
It's the first time I've recommended a book from 1938 on the book spot. I don't claim to be a book reviewer of the latest stuff. It's supposed to be things to make people think and sit back that I want to recommend. So this is the first and best expose of foreign policy journalism in the English language, written on the eve of the Second World War. Evelyn Waugh is a fantastic stylist, and one of the reasons I recommend it is simply to remember what the English language used to be like before political correctness got at it. We had a vast arsenal of subtle ways to describe people as being jumped up twits or whatever, and we've lost that. We need to recover it. Some of us could do with a laugh, and it's a funny book, so do relax to this book. But more significantly, it blows the lid on the fact that even back in those days, foreign policy journalism was in the bag. It describes, well, it's supposed to be about a guy who, through a comedy of errors, ends up being the foreign correspondent covering an African coup. And that's at that level, it's quite funny because it describes how the British and Americans, being insular nations, are so uninterested in the world that the policy journalists have to make up the news, and sometimes by swarming to a place they actually trigger the instability where there was none. And at that level, it's very interesting for people of our mindset to read. It also has press barons. One is Lord Copper, who is our hero's boss, who's the magnate of the Daily Beast, and across the road is Lord Zinc, who has an outfit called the Daily Brute. It's a satire on the Mail and the Express, or the Mirror of those days. And the point there is, of course, you can choose a Tory paper or you can choose a socialist paper. They both have the same agenda. But at the core of the book, right in the middle, you find that what we've been doing as the British is setting the Germans off against the Russians. And once he's in the middle of the action, our hero finds that the British were behind it all along, and the mineral rights of this African country were deliberately overvalued so that they could be fought over by the Russians and the Germans to weaken each other, while the British stood on and then gathered up the nice tidbits that remained after the battle. And when our hero gets back to Dover, he finds that a piece has been ghostwritten without his permission, saying how I done it, basically. And then there's even a bit where an American journalist, it's a sort of caricature of the overblown New York Times type, says, when describing British society, of course, we know that the Archbishop of Canterbury is behind Imperial Chemicals, which is an invented company, but even that is slipped in there, which is War's way of saying, on the eve of the Second World War, look, I know jolly well that the British are setting the Germans off against the Russians. I know that the news is made up. And he's also saying, I know that the Church of England has some dirty investments. So a lot of the stuff we discuss goes back decades and decades if you read the right material. And often it's best put in this novel form. You know, it's the best way to get away with certain things. A lady doing the same thing in our day is Sibel Edmonds, S-I-B-E-L Edmonds, who writes in novel form to avoid censorship from her ex-employers, the FBI.
And sorry, you also wanted to highlight the Tavistock Institute.
The reason I put that on there is it's by John Coleman, and even from the first page onwards, and you can find it as a PDF easily enough, the Tavistock Institute by John Coleman, you will find that he goes into the Rothmere, well, Lord Rothmere and Lord Northcliffe, two brothers, and how they controlled Fleet Street between the wars, and how really they did that because they wished to manipulate society psychologically. So if you read either a Mail or a Mirror story from a supposedly right-wing or left-wing perspective and think this paper is raising my hackles, even if it's on your side, well, that explains why. It's because the guys who went into the Fleet Street between the wars, as Evelyn Waugh describes in his own inimitable style, were there to manipulate society. I mean, Lord Copper, the Baron in the book, in Scoop, says, we have a foreign policy with regard to this and that. You see, so the foreign policy is being set by the papers, not by the government.
And we should just mention that the Tavistock Institute book is available. If you search for that on the internet, you'll find a PDF version of that. Okay, Alex, a number of months ago, possibly as much as a year ago, we were talking about Zurich Insurance and the fact that they had some liability exposure for people that were abused as children under UK local authority care. And you're possibly suggesting here that this may be related, the suicide of the chief executive?
It is, because if you get behind the paywall of that Wall Street Journal article, if you look on social media shares, sometimes one of the shares contains a code which will obviate the paywall, and you can read the whole thing that way more easily than you can by going to a browser direct. But anyway, he's the second guy, and one must point out that he'd resigned a few months before he did this. But he's the second guy at the top of Zurich Insurance to top himself with explicit reference to problems at the company and liabilities in the UK. And these are mentioned in the body of the article, overexposure in the UK and Zurich realizing that it couldn't gobble up more of the British market. That's not just because of general problems on their books. It's because, as the UK column's been in the vanguard of saying, or I should really pay tribute to the real victims who've gone and investigated this, and on behalf of the victims have come to the UK column, it's because Zurich Insurance, as you said, Mike, underwrites the almost bottomless liabilities that there are in all local authorities now for people who are abused in care. And as with the mortgage situation, if a class action was brought or individual lawsuits, it would bring down the whole industry, and then the reinsurers, who are all Switzerland or Germany based, would suffer. And we can't have that now, can we?
No, indeed. Who's being bought off then?
Well, this is an amazing thing that Geoffrey Van Orden, who was, if you remember back to the 90s, he was one of these arch Eurosceptics in the Conservative Party strict debate. And when people were openly calling each other traitors within the Conservative Party. And not just him, but on the right-hand side there, Kelly Tolhurst, who was no less, she's the Conservative Party candidate, a very vulgar woman who came out of nowhere to successfully battle Mark Reckless when he defected to UKIP in the Rochester and Stroud constituency. She's come out this week now and tweeted and said that she's considered the facts on both, or the arguments on both sides, and decided to remain. This is a woman who was specifically elected, parachuted in by Conservative Central Office, because she was going to pose as the conservative Eurosceptic to see off Mark Reckless, who'd become a UKIP Eurosceptic. You see, so here's a sitting MP was displaced by her, and now she's shown her true colours. And this in a week when we see a lot of conservative constituency associations are being told from headquarters that so-and-so, a sitting MP in many cases, is off the list. They won't be allowed to stand as Conservative Party candidate next time.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's move on to war or threat of war. War continuing in Yemen, of course, and people continue to be killed and injured there with pretty much no fanfare in the mainstream media. But a couple of days ago, we mentioned that Saudi Arabia had been placed on a United Nations blacklist because of the deaths of children in Yemen. And here we go, quick as a flash, a couple of days later, the United Nations has now been removed from that blacklist again, Patrick. And this is France 24 commenting on this. They say the United Nations on Tuesday was forced to defend its decision to remove the Saudi-led coalition fighting in Yemen from a blacklist of child rights violators after rights groups expressed dismay. And they quote a UN spokesman who said, "I don't think it's a reversal of policy. We will see what the review is and we will adjust the list as needed." Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, of course, got involved and they blasted Ban Ki-moon, who really doesn't do very much anyway. And of course, the situation was thrown back on the so-called rebels in Yemen who are being alleged to be using children to fight. This is spectacular.
Yeah. It's really made a mockery of the United Nations. And as we've pointed out on this program before, Saudi Arabia has paid a lot of money to the UN, and specifically the UN Council on Human Rights, to be sitting at its head and to be representing the issue of human rights globally. Some people might laugh at that. They might think, oh, that's ridiculous. But that's exactly what's happened. And then as if by magic, Mike, this story comes, and then Saudi Arabia announces that in conjunction with its coalition partners, and the Yemeni government, which is the so-called government in exile of President Hadi, who's Saudi's backing, are releasing 54 child soldiers, Houthi child soldiers, from prison. We don't know if they were soldiers. We don't know much. But this looks like a PR stunt that's timed perfectly with the UN announcement of removing Saudi Arabia from the blacklist. I can say without a doubt that the fact that the UN and the global media is characterizing the government in exile, who President Hadi he wasn't president when he left the country. Saudi Arabia is wanting to install their own puppet into Yemen, and they are waging a war to do that. And if you think that is a legitimate government, and you think that you can call Saudi a coalition, when in reality they are leading a marauding band of military pirates, destroying their neighbor Yemen, just to install their own puppet, and the UN can sit back and call this the Yemeni government, and they can call Saudi a coalition, we are living in a completely farcical time in history.
Well, this is what we're doing in Syria, of course, and what we did in Libya. Now, in the chat box, they're saying that RT is reporting that the UK has been supplying cluster bombs to Saudi Arabia and to be used in Yemen. I would just make the point there that it was actually Vanessa Beeley on this program and in 21st Century Wire, who has been highlighting Saudi use of British cluster bombs for quite some time.
And American cluster bombs.
Now, the Ministry of Defence denies that they supply Saudi Arabia with cluster bombs. What they don't deny is that they ever supplied Saudi Arabia with cluster bombs. So they may not be supplying Saudi with cluster bombs today, but they certainly have done in the past. And it's British cluster bombs that are being used, amongst others.
Against civilian targets,
yes.
Not military targets, okay, against people.
Yes.
That's the difference. This is where the war crime comes in. This is where the violation of all Geneva Conventions comes in and all arms agreements come in. And this is what's happening.
And the other point to make on this, of course, is that a proportion of the bomblets in the cluster bombs do not explode when they hit the ground. They end up being played with by children and explode at that point, maiming severely. So this is not a weapon that should be used it shouldn't be used at all, but it certainly shouldn't be used in civilian areas.
No, absolutely not. It's a great, very lucrative product. The bomb business is the best business going, Mike, because you blow up your stock and then you need to restock the shelves the next day, and on it goes. This is one of the things that fuels these sort of long wars like we see in Yemen.
Okay, now we're sort of getting short of time, so we'll run quickly through a couple of these. First of all, this is Bashar al-Assad, who is saying that we have no choice but victory in Syria. This is very disappointing to the United States because the US is really wanting to protect their tame terrorists in Syria, and so they're upset that there's any potential threat to them. But this is a pretty damning headline. I think this is probably the first time I've seen this type of headline in what's the relatively mainstream press, Patrick?
Yeah, I think up until this point, people have kind of been playing nice around the issue. It's been obvious what's going on. The U.S. has been characterizing, and its allies, including Britain, have been characterizing the moderate rebels. I think David Cameron said there were 70,000 of them waiting for UK airstrikes. Remember before the war vote last fall. Anyway, these moderate rebels existed, and somehow that they're moderate and they're not terrorists and they're not jihadists. And the fact of the matter is they are, all of them, and they're mixed with al-Nusra. In fact, they're under the command of al-Nusra. This is according to military experts. So this has all been basically a policy of deception led by the United States and its allies in order to buy time, to lengthen the conflict in Syria, and to continue destabilizing that country, continue the violence, continue the killing, continue the maiming. This is what it is. So now people are starting to call it out.
Yeah.
I did a segment on RT International on Friday. I said exactly this. I think this is a policy of deception, and I think this policy of deception used by the West to claim that they're somehow protecting their moderate rebels and to tell Russia or Syrian Air Force not to launch airstrikes against al-Nusra because they might hit their moderates. This is total fraud, in my opinion, and this is causing a lot of death and suffering in that country.
Yeah. Okay. Well, NATO's summit is coming up in Warsaw. So I thought we would show, it'll just last a minute or so, the promo video for this, and then I'm going to ask you both for your thoughts on it. So here's the NATO promo video for the upcoming summit in Warsaw.
Ladies and gentlemen,
Well, Pat, they've clearly got lots to talk about because they're holding it in a stadium.
Interesting, yeah, the use of imagery of football stadiums. I hope that's not foreshadowing for some sort of unfortunate event, maybe at the Euro 2016. I hope not, but it is kind of spooky watching these videos. So busy little bees in Brussels, OTAN, and it's costing a lot of money, Mike. So that's 2% of everybody's GDP going to pay for what you see in those videos there, which is a lot of men running around with very expensive kit, pretending to be fighting. Well, we said it's not Russia, but yet all indications are they keep pointing towards Russia as the main threat to Europe.
Yeah. Alex, NATO demonstrating a more corporate front every day.
My goodness me, Jasper Fogg Rasmussen has really tightened up the PR machine there, hasn't he? A slick and well-oiled machine there. The less said, the better, I think. That's the suggestion in the middle of that NATO is going to be boosting the defences of partners like Ukraine and Georgia. Well, forthcoming is an episode of Insight where we talk just about those countries. If you invest, I've seen it firsthand in many ways, if you invest in those countries' defences, you end up training a bunch of hotheads who can't wait to invade. And I wonder, any of those units, the SIGINT or the ComSec unit you saw in the middle of that, or the Rebro guys, or those attack helicopters, how much of that would survive contact with one Spetsnaz battalion or one S-500 battery, really? I'm not here to talk up the Russians. I don't take the Russian shilling, as I've been accused of being, but I happen to know a thing or two about the Russian military. And, for a start, or just one thing about it, during one exercise with Georgian and Armenian partners working alongside NATO, US and UK grunts had to take the same assault course as Armenians, and I think there were some Russians invited for show as well. And the Russians and Armenians ended up carrying the Americans and British over the finish line over their shoulders. That's the difference in capability now. Don't be fooled by the war drums.
No, Alex, just to your point, you made a really good, important point. No one really wants to talk about this because it's not very sexy, is that military on military direct confrontations in the 21st century are almost passé now. It's just, the public cannot take large, you can't have thousands of troops swarming across a field. I mean, this is from the First World War still thinking, but this is just for the promo video. Military, state on state, the public won't accept the casualty numbers. So the 21st century is about dirty wars, about proxy wars.
That's why Estonia, Lithuania, Georgia, and Western Ukraine are being set up to hurl themselves at Russia, because they're not proper countries in the Western mindset. So, if they lose 90% of their men in combat, then no skin off our nose.
Okay, well, Alex, what is going on with the EU and Turkey? Russia clearly looking at this situation and saying, these two organizations or these two national institutions are enemies?
I thoroughly recommend the website Russia Beyond the Headlines. I do know it's linked to, I think it's Nezavisimaya Gazeta or Novaya Gazeta, one of the two. It's state linked, I know that. But if you follow them on social media, they have a fantastic range of stuff introducing the Russian people and their history to you. And a lot of their stuff is not political but cultural. This is in the level of the societal, because it's polled among the Russian public. And people like the Levada Center have as advanced polling techniques as the West does. It's not propaganda. The Russian people have within the past year swung up from 9% to half of them, accepting that or believing that Erdogan's Turkey is a huge threat to them. And the number wanting EU membership or association, which used to be quite high outside Moscow actually, has dropped from a half to a quarter in the space of 1 year. So, I mean, you can blame that all on nasty Russian government propaganda if you want, but, the Russians are not stupid. They've been watching the news, they've been thinking and debating among themselves, and they've realized that the EU and Turkey are out to get them.
Sorry, I had my mic turned off there. Very interesting. Right, let's just move on to, because we're running out of time, to the Verdun honour trampled on. Alex?
Yes, this is by Marion Le Pen of the Front National, the French National Front. And she talks here in her tweet about these teenagers from France and Germany who were invited to the 100th anniversary commemoration of the Battle of Verdun, the bloodiest battle in world history. Most people in France and Germany have a great-grandfather who was at that battle, if not died at it. And the commemoration for the 100th anniversary of this worst bloodshed in the whole of human history was to get a bunch of choreographed French and German teenagers to run trampling over the graves across each other to the choreographs of a bunch of guys in black banging tom-toms and basically doing devilish drum beating. And as Marion Le Pen says, the honour of our forefathers has been trampled on. It's awful stuff. They all do sham fighting, these teenagers, then they all fall on the ground, and then a slender figure of death dressed in black on stilts comes across the field with a long top hat. There's this satanic death figure, and clicks his fingers pointing, and then they one by one get up. So it's almost like death is reaping his harvest of young people who can then go and serve him. And then they do a snazzy choreographed number celebrating their resurrection in the service of death. Having come so shortly after the Switzerland tunnel opening stuff at Gotthard, it's almost as if Western Europe was being ringed by a series of midsummer satanic festivals to mark out the ground. The next one may be in northern Italy or Germany, perhaps, to complete the circle.
Well, actually, I was going to ask because they are about to do something, some kind of commemoration for the Somme, and I just wonder if that's going to be the next one.
If so, I'd love to see Farage unleash his rhetoric on it, because if there's one thing you can't argue with him on, it's his love and knowledge of the Somme. So I can quite imagine that he will blow a gasket there, and not just him either.
Yeah. So what's going on in Germany?
This is the vice chairman, Mr. Alexander Gauland, of the Alternative for Germany party, AfD, and he called Mrs. Merkel a dictator chancellor. And one of the regional papers in Germany picking this up, everyone commented on it. One of them, the Western paper of some kind, said that he was using neo-Nazi language. NPD-Spruch is neo-Nazi party rhetoric. And apparently the offending phrase was not calling her a dictator, but more particularly he said, heute sind wir tolerant, morgen fremd in eigen Land. So we're tolerant today, and tomorrow we end up being strangers in our own country, a rhyming ditty. And apparently that's been branded or copyrighted by the neo-Nazi NPD. So if you say, if we're too tolerant of the migrants, then we're going to end up strangers in our own country, then you must be a neo-Nazi. So, ergo, the AfD party is neo-Nazi, and we don't need to listen to a thing they say. Simple, isn't it?
Indeed. German police really not taking, this is pretty much behaving a bit like the Irish police in some ways. So we've got 180 Sorosites, as you're calling them, threatening arson against a politician, and the police standing by and doing nothing.
Yes, and this wasn't just any old march past. This is as sacred as you can get in the heartland of Germany. It was on Ascension Day, Himmelfahrt, which is a big thing here on the continent. The Lutherans and the Catholics have a big day off on the Thursday in May when Ascension comes. It's a very sacred day of rest and family, even for the non-religious. And there he is in his Thuringian village, and these guys come with their whistles and their drums, and they don't just come through the village saying, we don't like Mr. Björn Höcke, the local, very middle-class, innocuous guy. And like a lot of these AfD guys, he came out of one of the two mainstream parties, the Christian Democrats and the Socialists, when he realized what was going on. They don't just bang on his drum, they walk past his house with banners, including one, and this is another German rhyming slogan, Was wir fordern ist nicht viel, burn down Höcke's Domizil. We're not demanding much, just burn down Höcke's house, they say, as they go past his house on this sacred family day of the year, really. It's atrocious stuff, and the German police, of course, were upping the ante there. They had, according to the article, 2 water cannon and a mounted police detachment from the Ruhr, shipped across the country. I think that's to intimidate the villagers, really, who are all voting for the AfD these days. But the article title says that there are double standards when AfD are attacked by these extreme guys, and you see much more of this. Even that very paper that reported it, the Frankfurter Allgemeine, was the epitome of official source news. And one of its ex-journalists, Udo Uppkotter, has actually come out with a big book saying, sorry, it was all bogus news we wrote in the Frankfurter, and I'm sorry I ever worked there. But even that paper, on its front cover now, is covering stories like Chancellor Merkel being called a dictator and AfD party guys being attacked at home. There's lots of stories of firebombs. These guys seem to be, doing the attacking, seem to be imported from the Czech Republic, and they do actually seem to be, hard-right fascist types. They're often lazily called left-wingers, but one of the people they're attacking now is the chairwoman of the Die Linke party, the hard left party. She's spoken out against unfettered migration now and got a pie in the face from these guys. So the more you look into it, they really are Sorosites. They're not German communists or ex-communists at all. They're neither German nor left-wing.
So just closing remarks then from both of you. If we look at if we remind ourselves of the comments that Lavrov was making a couple of days ago, where he said he was seeing that Europe is becoming increasingly destabilized. This isn't just happening in France. You've already described the French situation today as another revolution, Alex. This isn't just happening in France. This is happening right across the continent.
It's creeping up, and here in Holland we're in a kind of sane corner of the continent, and there are pockets of Italy that are the same, where life goes on as it did, and Switzerland. But I'm afraid it's spreading. I mean, I'm in Belgium 2 or 3 times a week on business trips, and you can feel the French mood spreading from the French-speaking part of Belgium through Brussels up into Flanders, which is more peaceful and Dutch-like, up into the Netherlands itself. That there is fear. I have to say. It is different from the kind of disgruntlement that there is in Britain in areas which have suffered greatly from recent policies. There is actually a sense on the streets and in people's homes in their conversations of where is this going to end up. And I think crucially what's happened since 2015 is Benelux, France, Germany, they've woken up, as before them only the Italians and Spanish had done, to the fact that their own parties are really putting them over a barrel. That's being realised now up and down the continent.
Pat, this is probably the reason why I believe people are being driven in this country towards a leave vote, because I believe my take on this is that they are being driven towards a leave vote. We will never actually get to leave. That's going to create increasing tension among people in this country, with immigration and the health service and a whole bunch of issues, TTIP. Chaos is being created right across the continent, and I don't think that Britain is going to escape.
No, really, when you boil it down, Mike, whether the vote is to leave or to stay, I'm afraid to say that it's not going to change a darn thing. And all these things that we've just talked about, this perfect storm that you've just illustrated here, that's not going to go away. All these things have been put in place and set into motion by the same leadership that's presiding over this so-called choice or the future of Europe in Britain, and that goes for the continent too. They're all parties to the problem, and I've never seen anyone address the problem yet. And also, I'm going to say this: we didn't see Nigel Farage nor David Cameron mention the word TTIP last night during the mock debate, the non-debate debate. It was not even mentioned, so that should be a good indication to people that's actually the main agenda. That's the most important part of this whole perfect storm.
Yes. Okay. Well, look, thank you very much, both of you, Alex Thomson and Patrick Henningsen. That's it for today. We will see you again at 1 o'clock tomorrow. Hope to see you then. Thanks for joining us. Bye-bye.